Hello, friends. This week's lie is about vote by mail, one of Trump's new boogeymen on the back of which he can build a fantasy world full of fraudulent votes from dead people and Republicans who actually care about free and fair elections. Here's the lie taken from his interview, in air quotes, with Hannity, who as usual just lets him spout treasonous drivel.
Vladimir Putin said something, one of the most interesting things. He said, your election was rigged because you have mail-in voting. He said, mail-in voting, every election. He said, no country has mail-in voting.
Now, this map shows vote-by-mail use globally, but I've also made a list of the countries that use it. Ready, Yakko? Australia, Austria, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Canada, Fiji, France, Germany, Greece, Iceland, India, Ireland, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malaysia, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Netherlands, New Zealand, Pakistan, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Poland, Slovenia, South Korea, Spain. Whew! The data I found is from IDEA, which is the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. It's a global intergovernmental organization devoted to free and fair elections. There's lots of great information on their site. Check it out later. The next set of graphs and graphics breaks down percentage of voting in major areas of the globe, and then gives a country-by-country list of whether or not they have vote by mail, who is eligible, etc. Then there's a little blurb on methodology for the study. Just for some clarification, SVA stands for Special Voting Arrangements. Here they describe the types of voting looked at in the study and mention that there is a separate database tracking online voting specifically, which we won't get into today.
It's impossible to have mail-in voting and have honest elections. And he said that to me. It was very interesting because we talked about 2020. He said, you won that election by so much.
Now, aside from the fact that it doesn't make any sense that the dictator of a foreign adversary would have more accurate information on American elections than we would, by now, anyone with half a brain should know that everything Trump and the MAGA stooges said about 2020 voter fraud was bunk. Here we have a Washington Post article which goes into specific challenges of his lies about mail voting, which go all the way back to the pandemic era. The article talks about Oregon, which has had all mail elections dating back to 1999. And as we will see in later slides, they have less than 0.001% fraud rate. The article talks about a 2016 study that attempted to identify potential cases of voter fraud by analyzing states' voter history data. That study came up with another insignificant number. It highlights the fact that election workers are trained to detect signature discrepancies, which more often than not are accidental and can be fixed with an inquiry. The article summary says that all available data indicates that voter fraud in mail elections is extremely rare. Out of 5 states that had all mail elections in 2016, there was an error rate range from 0.0014 to 0.004%. And in decades of data tracking, the state of Oregon had only 82 felony convictions out of tens of millions of votes cast between 1990 and 2019. An important caveat to that is the total of convictions includes crimes not related to mail-in voting, meaning they were related to some sort of in-person fraud. The article also calls out conservatives who frequently cite a huge list of voter fraud cases from the Heritage Foundation. But the problem is that publicly available list only shows 1,285 cases out of hundreds of millions of votes cast. And specifically related to mail voting, the number of cases related to absentee ballots is 204 out of 250 million votes cast by mail in the past 20 years. Our next bit of factual evidence comes from the MIT Election Data and Science Lab and their study on voting by mail and absentee voting updated in 2024. They have a very illustrative graph that shows the decline from 1996 to 2018 of in-person election day voting, with a steady increase in mail voting and in-person before election day voting, otherwise known as early voting. What's interesting about this graph, though, is that you can see in 2020 when mail voting surpassed both early voting and in-person same-day voting due to the pandemic. And while that number didn't remain at 42%, it has only dropped off slightly to about 31% of the electorate voting by mail in 2022. Then there's an infographic that has a timeline featuring absentee voting laws throughout the U.S., with a little description of a couple of these significant developments. In the 1980s, California became the first state to allow eligible voters to request absentee ballots for any reason at all, including for their convenience. This is what we call no-excuse absentee voting, and by 2023, 28 states and Washington, D.C. had adopted similar absentee voting laws. The researchers then discussed the impact on voter turnout, which shows a slight increase in voter turnout for midterm and presidential elections, but they estimate a higher turnout for primaries, locals, and special elections. They point out an important concept, however, that the increase comes from bringing marginal voters into the electorate and also keeping the voters who might otherwise drop out. More people voting in our elections is a good thing, right? They also discuss questions surrounding voter fraud and vote by mail and give anecdotal reasons for how there could potentially be more opportunity for fraud by mail. However, they also assert that, as with all forms of voter fraud, documented instances of fraud related to vote by mail are rare. They bring up 3 high-profile voter fraud cases, but when you consider that tiny number of proven fraud cases against the thousands of elections that have taken place in individual cities and counties over the last 30 years, we see that it's once again absolutely insignificant. They also mentioned some kind of cockamamie argument from detractors that voting by mail means some voters are not fully informed of the decisions they're making when they fill out their ballots early. But that seems like a load of conjecture, to be polite. So next, I want to share with you something kind of random but interesting I found from the National Vote at Home Institute. They did a cost-saving benefit analysis for voting at home, and this slide gives some pretty interesting information. They highlight Colorado, where election costs have decreased by an average of 40% because of the reduction in provisional ballots, polling locations, and poll workers. Even low population states such as Montana see an average savings of $2 million per election cycle. They also mention a report from the Center for American Progress, which estimated that waiting in line to vote in 2012 alone cost Americans $544 million in lost productivity and wages. I won't go over the whole slide. You can pause and read yourself if you want, or go check it out with the link that I provide. But it's interesting that they close the argument by quoting the Federal Election Commission book on mail ballot elections, which lists all of the headaches that go into planning and conducting in-person elections. And it's a lot. Up now, I found a paper from 2017 by the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, and it's titled Debunking the Voter Fraud Myth. This one keeps it simple and straightforward. It just cites dozens of studies and court cases that confirm the high integrity of U.S. elections. These slides will go quick just to keep things short, but again, I'll link below. One court case in particular that they cite is when the Supreme Court voted in favor of Indiana's 2008 strict voter ID law. They specifically noted in their ruling that there was zero fraud found in that state's elections. Unfortunately, this more or less confirms that conservatives, even on the highest court in the land, are knowingly supporting ID laws that are acts of voter suppression and not fraud prevention. Brennan also lists various government investigations that found fraud to be extremely rare. And even the cases that are found to be legit, they don't come anywhere close to the number of votes that would actually be needed to change an election's outcome. In summary, the Brennan paper refers to the long-standing history of racially charged voter suppression in America as being the actual problem with voting and not imaginary cases of fraud. So, the question you may be asking yourself, and the question being asked of pundits and commentators on news programs, is why is he doing this? Why does Trump care so much about mail-in votes? Well, I'm pretty sure I've figured it out. As you can see in this snippet from a Newsweek article on the topic of vote by mail, not only are Democratic-leaning states more prone to using mail-in ballots, but specifically, the battleground states of Pennsylvania and Michigan have lots of mail-in votes, specifically from Democratic voters. We've already talked about Oregon, but other blue states such as California and Colorado would be greatly affected by canceling vote by mail. This interactive map from the Newsweek study shows which states feature the most mail-in ballots. They point out that in California, 83% of total votes came via mail-in ballot. That's 13.2 million votes out of 15.9 million total voters. Now, even though California tends to skew more Democratic, just for the sake of argument, let's say that half of those ballots are Democrats, half are Republicans. That means that 6.6 million Democratic ballots would not be counted, which is a large enough percentage of the electorate to sway the popular vote significantly towards a Republican candidate. So basically, he's trying to throw out all of the votes that he knows he'll never be able to get, or any other MAGA extremist for that matter. Get rid of 50 million Democratic votes across the country, and even someone like MTG could possibly win the general election. Excuse me, I need to throw up at even the thought. Sorry about that. As usual, Trump doesn't realize or doesn't care that he's screwing over a lot of his own voters, too. The Newsweek map showed several red-leaning states that rely on mail-in ballots, and in particular, the Republican stronghold of Arizona has an 84% vote-by-mail ratio. It makes sense. I mean, who the hell wants to be outside in Arizona? Even in November, it's still 89 degrees at 8 a.m. Not surprisingly, the states with the least mail-in voting are in the South, including Texas, where the vote-by-mail ratio is less than 10%. So, yeah, that's what this big lie is all about. He's trying to sow doubt in our election integrity, and he's trying to convince all of the cultists that getting rid of vote by mail will ensure fair elections, while he's also winking and nodding and letting everyone know that this is a way to disenfranchise Democrats at large and minority populations in red and or contested states. But once again, a Google search and just an hour or two of reading will prove that he's completely full of shit, as are all of the other Republican lapdogs that parrot whatever the dear leader wants to be the talking point of the day. Don't believe the hype, though. Our elections are fine, and voting by mail is fine. Okay, bye.